Have you ever wondered why Jesus walks on water? Is there a deeper meaning? Is there a deeper purpose that we're not seeing? When Jesus walks on water, he's doing something so much deeper that you'll miss if you don't understand the Old Testament. What if I told you Jesus is actually fulfilling prophecy when he's walking on water, and a lot of people miss it? So what prophecy is he fulfilling? Let's read the scriptures to find out. In Matthew 14:22, we have the classic story of Jesus walking on water. I'm just going to skim through it real quick and show you some Old Testament passages that relate to this, okay? The disciples get into the boat after feeding the multitudes, right? Jesus multiplies bread and the fish. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he goes up on a mountain to pray. But you have the disciples in a boat dealing with the waves and the wind, and it's really late at night. The fourth watch, Jesus walks to them on the sea. Okay, so Jesus walking on the water here, they think he's a ghost. Jesus says, "Don't worry, it's I." Me, Jesus. Peter answered, "If it's you, make me come to you on the water." And Jesus does say, "Come." And you know what Peter does? He walks on the water with Jesus. Okay, Peter gets afraid. He goes, "Lord, save me." He starts to sink. Jesus reaches out his hand and he takes hold of Peter, saying, "Why don't you have little faith? Why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And guess what? The disciples recognize this is the Son of God and they worship him. This is a turning point in the framework of the disciples. They finally realize who Jesus is. Now, there's so many Old Testament passages I want to show you. But before we get to those Old Testament passages, you need to see what's taking place here. Jesus is showing he has authority, power, and dominion over the wind, over the seas, over what brings death. People can drown in the waters, right? And so Jesus is showing his authority and dominion over the forces of nature, specifically over the chaotic waters that can bring death. Untamed, uncontrolled water just takes over, and the disciples are afraid. That's why he calms the wind. That's why the storm calms. And Jesus in Matthew's gospel has already calmed the storm up to this point. He's making a statement, especially when walking on water. Jesus is saying, by walking on the water, I have authority over and I'm above the sea that the disciples are afraid of. In the Old Testament, there's a theme and a pattern of the God who has authority and power, not just to bring people out of the chaotic waters of death and into life, but the God who actually controls these waters and sovereignly ordains where they stop. And Jesus here is actually following a pattern and a theme all throughout the Old Testament that I want to show you. So in Genesis 1, at the creation of the world, it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep." Right? So we have deep, dark waters. That's the current condition of the earth right now as God is creating. And watch where the Spirit of God is. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. This is the very first two verses of the entire Bible. At creation, we have the Spirit of God overseeing, right, above and even facilitating the dark, deep waters that cover the face of the earth at this point. And we're about to see God bring life and land and substance out of this, but the Spirit of God being hovering over the face of the waters is showing the authority of God, right, to create out of what is only current dark, deep waters. In Genesis chapter 7, we see Noah. He's rescued from the flood, okay? Verse 15, it says, "They went into the ark," this is Noah and his family, "two and two of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. And those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in." But we see the flood continuing 40 days on the earth. But God shuts Noah rather. He shuts Noah in. Why? To protect Noah and all those who have the breath of life on the ark with him. In other words, what is God doing here? The flood waters that bring death upon the earth and remove the wicked, those flood waters don't touch Noah and his family and those who are in the ark because God has protected them. God has shut them in. And God is going to bring Noah and his family and these animals through these flood waters to the other side where there's almost a new earth of sorts, where the world doesn't look the way it used to because the flood waters have prevailed for so long. In other words, God is bringing Noah and those who have the breath of life on the ark through these chaotic waters, flood waters of death, to the other side where there is life. This is God having dominion and power and authority over the flood waters, not just to remove the wicked, but to protect the righteous. In Exodus 14:21, we have another example of God showing his power and authority over the chaotic waters of death by bringing people through it to the other side where there's life and sustaining people through it. Moses here at the Red Sea with the Israelites stretches out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night. In other words, God is over what? The wind and the sea. And the people of Israel and the Egyptians are seeing that like with their own eyes. And he made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. Just like God divides the waters from the waters above, from the waters below at Genesis, or in Genesis. And at creation, God brings land up from the waters in the creation story as well. We see a little picture of that here. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. But these same waters, the sea that splits for the Israelites, actually end up being death to the Egyptians and destroying the Egyptian army, right? God closes these waters in on the Egyptians, fumbling my pen, not just to bring death upon the wicked, but to show how he sustains his people, who he wants, through these chaotic waters to the other side where there's life. This is, again, God showing his power and authority over the waters and over the forces of nature as the creator. In Joshua chapter 3, we're going to see something, again, very similar to what we've seen, where God splits the seas, protects people through it, sustains life through the chaotic waters of death, and shows his authority and power over the waters. So when the people set out from their tents, the Israelites, to pass over the Jordan with the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and as soon as those bearing the Ark had come as far as the Jordan River, right? So here we are at the Jordan, very famous location in Israel, and the feet of the priests bearing the Ark were dipped into the brink of the water. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. The waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap. Sounds like the Red Sea, right? Very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan, and those flowing down toward the Sea of the Arabah, the Salt Sea, were completely cut off, right? In other words, the waters are split again, just like the Red Sea, just like at Genesis. And the people passed over opposite Jericho, right? Now the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. The point here is not necessarily that it's dry ground, but the point is that the waters split, that God is over the waters, that the people couldn't pass over on their own. He has to split them. He has authority and dominion over the waters they can't cross and get through on their own. And he brings them, he sustains them to the other side on dry ground, where they're passing over into a new season for the nation of Israel, the promised land, right? So this is, again, the people being sustained by God through the chaotic waters to the other side, where there's a sort of new life and new world for them. In 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 8, you'll see Elijah and Elisha crossing over the Jordan River. Again, we see the Jordan River, a specific location, a very famous location. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it up, and struck the water. This is Elijah transferring his prophetic mantle to Elisha, and Elisha's taking up what Elijah's leaving, because Elijah's going home. And the water was parted to the one side and to the other, till the two of them could go over on dry ground. So here we have, again, dry ground coming up from what? Waters. The waters that they couldn't cross on their own. The waters part, just like we saw at the Red Sea with Joshua. We see that God separating the waters at Genesis. God is over the waters that people can't pass through to the other side on their own, which, again, effectively, the waters in general, the chaotic seas, untamed, uncontrolled, that God is over, those seas will bring death apart from God sustaining life through it. Not to say all water is bad, but untamed, uncontrolled, chaotic waters can only bring death and be a detriment to people. And God sustains Elijah and Elisha to the other side. Here's a sort of transferring the prophetic mantle from Elijah to Elisha, a sort of new life for both of them on the other side, and they're sustained on dry ground. There are tons more examples I could give, but let's look at Jonah. Jonah's swallowed up by the great fish, right? He's overcome by the waters. Again, there's a storm that's calmed when the people throw Jonah over, right? And Jonah ends up being eaten, and from the belly of the fish, he prays this. He says, "The waters closed in over me to take my life." Again, we have waters that take life, right? Uncontrolled, chaotic sea waters that can only bring death, and people can't pass through on their own without the help and the aid of God. The deep surrounded me, the deep that we saw kind of at Genesis. Weeds were wrapped about my head. At the roots of the mountains, he says. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit. O Lord my God, when my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord. And my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, I will sacrifice to you. What I vowed I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Notice how Jonah makes this about salvation. God bringing his life from the pit. God sustaining his life through the waters of death. This is salvation for Jonah. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon what? Dry land. Again, we see God over the waters and over really all forces of nature and creatures that exist, sovereignly ordaining that a fish would swallow up Jonah, sustain him, and bring him through to dry land, just like we saw with Joshua and Moses, people of Israel, Elijah, Elisha. And here's the final passage, Isaiah chapter 43, starting in verse 2. God says, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. And then he says the same about fire. When you walk through fire, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, right? You shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. For I am the Lord your God. In other words, God over and over and over proves himself, reveals himself, shows his power and dominion and sovereignty by bringing people through the waters that on their own, untamed, can only bring death, but God tames it. God controls the waters. God sustains life through the waters of the seas. Now back in Matthew chapter 14, we have Jesus walking on water. Peter says, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water. And he came to Jesus. And again, we have Jesus calming the wind. We have Peter here, sustained by Jesus, not just passing on dry ground through the waters like we've seen in the Old Testament, but this time Jesus enables someone to walk on the waters with him. No splitting of the seas, no dry ground. This is different. This is Jesus showing himself not to be someone who splits the seas, but to be someone who is sovereignly over the waters, to effectively allow someone to walk on the waters with him. This is Jesus demonstrating his power as the Son of God, as God in the flesh, the eternal word emanating from the Father. Jesus is showing that he's worthy of worship, and this is why the disciples worship him. I think they're catching on to what he's really doing, that he can save life and bring life through the chaotic waters of death to, bring people to the other side where there's life. And he does that for the disciples. He calms the storm earlier in the gospel. He calms the storm here. He allows Peter to walk on water to show that Jesus has power over the forces of nature as the creator. And he can sustain life, not just on dry ground through the sea, but he can make the waters themselves be as dry ground for people like Peter who have faith. It's a picture of salvation. And Jesus is fulfilling the prophetic images we see all throughout the Old Testament of the God who is over the chaotic waters and sustains life through them. Listen, if you want to learn how to read the Bible, maybe you're frustrated, confused, overwhelmed, you don't know where to start, check out our free 40-day Bible study program linked in the description below. It's completely free. It's online. Or visit abovereproachministry.com. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you haven't already subscribed, go ahead and do that and hit the bell so you can be notified of any future videos that come out. And check out abovereproachministry.com. We have completely free Bible study courses, a 40-day program, a 27-day, and 11-day program, all kinds of free resources. You can get a copy of my book. You can join our online church. You can get some merch. We have a bunch of stuff at abovereproachministry.com. And it's also linked in the description below. Go check that out. And thanks for watching.